Hey folks, and welcome to Tyrdom. So today I have an interesting theory, or even a bit strange theory, to share with you. But before I start digging into that, we need to present our two main characters for the day. It's two books. The first one is the Iliad, and the second book is, of course, the Odyssey. And before we start talking about this particular theory, we need to understand what the Iliad and the Odyssey is, because they are more than old books, old dusty books. Many people claim that they are the foundation of the Western civilization itself, and there's a good case to be made for that, actually. And if we start out with the Iliad, the red one, which is quite fitting, as you will understand in a second. The Iliad is basically a war epic, and the story centers around the Trojan War and the ending of the Trojan War, around Achilles, the warrior hero, and around rage, the battle rage, and the fate and the death and the tragic nature of heroism itself. It's also the death of the hero. The whole outline of that can be read in the Iliad. And I have mentioned this on Tyrdom before, but the story itself is quite heavy, and it's very violent, and it's filled with glory, but also a good portion of grief and death. Meanwhile, the Odyssey, the blue one, is quite different from the Iliad, and it's more of a story about a voyage, and it's a long voyage after the war has ended. And you can follow, for example, Odysseus, who wanders through storms and islands and shipwrecks, monsters, and strange peoples. He's lured into temptation by the sirens, and the story is basically an outline of him traveling to the edges of the world, visiting liminal spaces, and it's a journey for him to get home to Ithaca, to his family. And the funny thing about these two works is that you get a sense that when these were written down, they already felt ancient. It's something that it's quite hard to put your finger on, but they are ancient. You can just feel it intrinsically when reading them. And traditionally, these texts has been attributed to the author Homer. And you could say that he's a semi-legendary Greek poet who's believed to have lived around the 8th century BC. But the stories themselves are most likely far older than that. And the scientists and the archaeologists and historians are not in consensus here, but as far as I can see, the memories in these stories are believed to come from the Bronze Age world around 1200 BC or even earlier. So these are very old works. And originally, much like the Kalevala or the Eddas, these were not books from the beginning. These were oral traditions, and they were passed on from generation to generation by poets and singers. And this was done for a long time, way before they were ever written down. And this means something important. The world inside these stories most likely were ancient by the time Homer found them himself and wrote them down. And I think that matters, because the thing with oral traditions, it's a quite peculiar thing. They preserve fragments of reality across centuries, while slowly transforming them into myths and symbolism, and the whole thing with archetypes, which I have mentioned here many times before. And I have had these two particular books for a long time. Unfortunately, these are not the original copies I received as a young kid, but I've read them both in a young age, and I had to get new copies some years ago. But I actually revisited the Odyssey, and with the lens I have today, I start to interpret it a bit differently, because the deeper I read, in particular the Odyssey, the less Mediterranean it seems to be to me. And I'm not meaning that in a literal sense, and not completely, of course, but there's something about the atmosphere in the book. And there's a darkness to the texts that doesn't align with the Mediterranean and the Greek environment. I've been to Greece many times, but there's a coldness to certain parts of the texts, and there's descriptions of mist and storms and violent seas and distant islands. And these things feel strangely northern to me. So let's talk about the theory, because I'm not the creator of this theory. So there is a theory proposed by an Italian researcher, which name I will do my best to pronounce, but it's Felice Vinci, that argues something that is almost unbelievable. But please follow along. I think it will be worth it. So he claimed that parts of Homer's world, which he described, most likely were northern. Northern as in the sea that is described is the Baltic Sea, and North Atlantic, and possibly connecting to the older Bronze Age memories far beyond from the Mediterranean. And before I move on here, I just want to be crystal clear. This is not mainstream academic consensus. This is just indulgence of interesting theories, okay? But the theory itself is quite fascinating, because it's touching on something deeper, and the possibility that the myths themselves preserves ancient cultural memory. Again and again, Homer describes the dark sea in the Odyssey. He describes the sea as wine dark, meaning it's not turquoise, it's not calm, and it's certainly not idyllic. And on the contrary, it's cold, it's dark, and it's dangerous. This is described many, many times in the Odyssey. And for anyone of you who has visited the Mediterranean, it's a lot of things, but it's not cold, dark, and not idyllic. And the sea that Homer describes, he's almost describing it like a living force, quite animistic, quite like the Northerners describe the sea, as a power, as a vacuum. In the Odyssey, Odysseus is constantly in the mercy of various storms and currents and fog and a level of constant uncertainty and violent water. At one point in the book, Homer writes, and I quote, "A great wave struck him from above, dreadful and terrible." And when you read passages like that, the world sometimes feels less like the Mediterranean and that you imagine today, and more like the harsh northern seas that shaped so many coastal cultures over the spans of time. And there's another interesting thing here about Ithaca. And in the Odyssey, Homer describes Ithaca like, and I quote again, "low-lying furthest from the west." And the thing is that geographically, the modern Greek Ithaca does not perfectly fit that description at all, actually. And this became one reason why researchers began asking if fragments of older geography may survive beneath the surface of the story. And I just need to underline again, these are just very interesting stories, but there's no consensus around these things. But it raises interesting questions, I have to say. And these are not the only things that turns your mind to the Northern Hemisphere in the Odyssey. There's a lot of depictions that describes heavy cloaks and gray weathers and sudden storms and long journeys through dim horizons and uncertain seas. And some researchers has even speculated that descriptions of prolonged light resemble northern twilight or white nights. For example, this is actually nighttime where I live, and it's light, At some points during the year here in the Nordics, we basically don't have nighttime, and the equivalent in wintertime, it's dark all the time. Personally, I think we should, tread carefully around claims like these, but the thing with oral traditions is that I think people tend to underestimate how far they actually traveled back in the day. The stories traveled from merchant to poet to singer to the head of the village to the earl, etc. And also people migrated in a way that people might not understand today either. And the myths migrated with them. It's not totally unlike the case of Tyr, which basically is believed to have a connection to Mars. And the name Tyr itself means God. So if we're going Indo-European here. But it's not just language and not just blood. but sacred landscapes themselves. I've touched upon this many times here on the channel, of course, but there's memories of rivers and mountains and forests and seas. And ancient people, they did not separate myth and history in the way we do today. We have to understand that this separation is quite novel when we look at human history. To us today, a story is either factual or it's fictional. But to them, it could be one and the same at the same time. A place could be real, it could be symbolic, it could be ancestral and sacred simultaneously. And this was just a normal day at the office to them. And this is where mythology becomes far more interesting than modern people often realize. Because myths are not necessarily lies. I have talked about this many times. For example, the connection with the Norse gods and the archetypes and the North stars of living. But sometimes they are memories that are, what should we say, transformed into symbols over enormous spans of times, like dreams carrying fragments of forgotten worlds, if you will. And honestly, even outside this Baltic theory, Greek mythology already contains Nordic echoes. I'm of course thinking of the concept of Hyperborea, the mysterious northern land beyond the north wind. That is quite famous. I guess most of you have heard about it. But it's a distant land described to be associated with purity and mystery and almost a supernatural light. And even the Greeks imagined that something ancient and sacred existed beyond the familiarity of their southern world. And across Indo-European mythology, we can see these themes repeat. The cosmic oceans and world rivers and the long winters, journeys into darkness, and an allurement of distant sacred lands beyond the known horizon. Very human stories that is playing with our imagination. And these patterns tend to come again and again and again over different parts of Europe and over different parts of history. Not because the cultures necessarily copied each other directly, because the human beings carried these old archetypes and old memories over continents and over vast distances of time. And I think that might be the case for why the Odyssey still resonates up until this day. Because fundamentally, maybe it's not really about Greece. It's about exile, and it's about distance and a longing. And a man trying to get back home to his family. To a world that no longer feels entirely familiar. And I think that modern people understand that feeling more than they realize. And especially now that Christopher Nolan is making a new version of the Odyssey, for example. But the feeling of cultural distance and spiritual distance with which I have outlined before here. There's a sense among people now, I think, that something ancient has been forgotten. And in that sense, the Odyssey is not only about returning home, it's also about actually remembering where home even is. And no, now I don't personally believe Homer literally described Scandinavia. Probably not in a simple sense, but I think that parts of his writings preserves myths that are in turn preserved in layers over vast time periods. Fragments of earlier migrations, trade routes, and climate memories, and lost landscapes, and ancient fears, old as humanity itself. And the concept of sacred geography that has been carried from one world into another. Because I think the possibility alone for this is very, very fascinating. And if it has a kernel of truth to it, it means that the myths are alive. And it's not about dead literature, not a bone-dry book from an old man writing something in ancient Greece, but rather about rivers of memory flowing through civilizations over vast distances of time. And if you think about it as in a picturesque way, you can look at it as a river that flows over continents and brings sediment with it over different parts of the world in a continuous stream. And I think that this is why the old mythologies still resonates with us today, and they survive these vast distances of time. Not necessarily because they are perfect from a historical sense, but they speak to something ancient within us, inside humans, and about the humanity in us. The concept of the storm and the voyage and the exile and the return home. And all of these things existed way before Greece, and they will exist long after us as well. So that was the theory and the little story about the Iliad and the Odyssey. I hope you enjoyed my little venture here. That turned out to be a quite long venture this time, but hopefully you followed along. If you appreciated this video, please consider leaving a comment, a like, or even becoming a channel member if you feel that it's alluring to the siren call. Yeah, I think that's all, folks. Take care. Talk to you later. And as usual, Tyrdom out.